Welcome to episode 2 of our CPO Conversation series. This week, we're joined by Tom Mills, Head of Procurement and Properties at Bibby Financial Services. Tom is host of Procurement Bites, and he's very active on LinkedIn, Twitter, and TikTok. Tom, let's start with why did you get into procurement? And more importantly, why did you come back?
Great question. And I think lots of people struggle to answer that question in terms of why did they get into procurement, because it's quite often a career that people fall into. There's no kind of university career path or school education that leads necessarily directly into procurement. My background was actually direct purchasing, buying. So I originally worked in an FMCG environment where I was directly responsible for the purchasing of goods. And originally I absolutely loved the negotiation element. So the commercial, getting the best deals, working with suppliers to make sure that you get the best deals, and obviously the impact that you can have on a business. So that was my background. And then moving into procurement, it was actually the opportunity to be able to influence and shape the way an organization buys its goods and services. I realized was an even bigger way you could impact the effectiveness of a business. So it was kind of, I've had a split career. I've had 10 years of direct purchasing and 10 years of procurement. To your point on recently, in terms of I kind of left a procurement environment and then came back into a procurement environment. I think just circumstances at the time, and I don't want to go into specifics, but were getting to the stage where I was actually falling a bit out of love with procurement. I think the environment wasn't perhaps the procurement environment that appeals to me. So I place a great deal of emphasis on integrity in what we do. It's all about dealing with suppliers in the right way, dealing with stakeholders in the right way, and being really honest and transparent in terms of how you go about things. So I think I just went for a period where I kind of fell out of love with it. I think what I realized when I left procurement was actually how much I do love procurement, and sometimes it's quite important in your career to take a break and actually think it reminds you of how you might want to shape procurement moving forward. So now I'm back in the procurement environment, and as you can probably see through my LinkedIn content and TikTok, thanks for mentioning that. I just realized I've got a passion for it more than ever, really.
So you mentioned the LinkedIn piece there. So you've gone from 10,000 followers the last time we spoke, I think that was back in June, to 14,000 followers now. What do you think is resonating with people on LinkedIn?
I think what I've been really clear on is having an opinion. And I think I see a lot of really good content out there and a lot of content creators, but what I've realized is that the more confident you are kind of nailing your opinions to a mast and being clear on them, the more it resonates and the more people kind of engage. And the other thing is, I'd like to think that I mentioned earlier my kind of renewed passion for procurement that comes across in my posts. So I think it's really important to try and inspire others. I do also feel like, and this is potentially where it might get a little bit controversial, but I'll go with it anyway. We are kind of on the cusp of a bit of a wave of change within procurement. So what I mean by that is there's been kind of old school ways of thinking that have been dictated by kind of textbook theory that's been around really since the mid-90s. And there's kind of a new breed of thinking around procurement, which is becoming far more diverse, far more innovative, looking at things like technology, looking at all the ways that we can improve procurement, but moreover improve our impact on organizations. So it's been great to see that from other content creators, and I've been inspired by other people who write about that, and then it becomes quite reciprocal. I think the other thing is, don't underestimate the power of networking. I've got so many contacts, even like yourself, Rich, that I've met through LinkedIn, which I now feel like if I've ever got a question or I've ever got anything that I want to kind of delve into, I know who to speak to. And I think with the world that we're in today, post-COVID, with more people working from home, less conferences, that type of thing, it's really important that we all build our network.
Totally, yeah, and I'd agree. We're definitely on a cusp here, and there is there's an old school that the way I refer to it is that you've got these people who were purchasing, procurement, whatever it is, in the sort of the 80s and 90s, and it was very much an admin function back then. And I know there was some thinking that was going on, and there was, some of it was maybe quite ahead of its time, but actually business has changed so much even in the last 5 years that for procurement to survive the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years, we've really got to, as you say, embrace things like the technology, embrace other things within the organization that will maintain procurement's relevancy. So yeah, I see that as a big one. I mean, you've recently posted about the procurement dinosaurs, and obviously I think one of the things that's great about LinkedIn and putting something out there that's a little bit controversial sometimes. If you put something out there that's not very controversial, then it obviously doesn't get much engagement. So you've got to be controversial to an extent to actually get that engagement going. But then it generates this debate. And unfortunately, I think the procurement dinosaurs they're not always on LinkedIn, so they might not be there to defend themselves. But I think, what do you see that can be gained from this new way of working, and what should the dinosaurs be doing?
Yeah, I just want to be clear first and foremost. I'm never deliberately controversial. So what I mean by that is, I know that there's a certain style on LinkedIn whereby people might be deliberately controversial because they won't know or gain likes or views or whatever. What I do is I will state firmly what my opinion is on something, and I think the procurement dinosaurs one shouldn't be taken too seriously, other than it's a metaphor for how we need to change. And I want to be very clear as well. Dinosaurs isn't an age thing. I'm no spring chicken myself. It's more it's more around a way of thinking. So actually, funnily enough, I've seen some early 20s procurement folk who are quite rigid in their thinking.
Me too.
Yeah, it's about the confidence in terms of how do we move the function forward. So in my view, it's really important that we are challenging, because without being too grandiose about this, think about the impact that we can have on the world. So at the moment, there's a huge agenda around sustainability and around having to face into some really massive challenges that we've got, things around inflation, fuel prices, etc. So unless procurement really does change, to your point earlier, if we don't adapt, then we're just going to become quite a defunct and administrative function. So I'm kind of proud to be leading the charge on that type of thinking, because I think that it's about what impact do you want to have on an organization. There's just something else you mentioned earlier as well, which made me think. I think lots of people don't truly understand the difference between purchasing and procurement. And I think within this metaphor, within this definition, whether it's dinosaurs or anything else, you can pretty much succinctly describe for a story what the difference is between purchasing and procurement. Procurement is far more creative, far more innovative, far more holistic. Purchasing, while it's an important element, and I'm not deriding that, because as I've already said, I've got 10 years of career in the purchasing environment, it is far more about cost, whereas procurement is far more about value. So I think procurement is an interesting word, because I don't think it's necessarily clearly communicated or clearly defined. And I think therefore that's where some of the kind of difference in thinking exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think, and you're right. Procurement's a difficult word because it means different things to different people, and it doesn't really accurately reflect the brand and what we do necessarily. It's used interchangeably with purchasing in certain organizations, and in certain organizations, the stakeholders there will have a preconceived idea of what it was based on experiences in other organizations, and you're always fighting against that, and that's a difficult thing, really. So we're both live music fans. What's your favorite band at the moment?
I'm a little bit out of touch with current music. I think we've had conversations around this in the past. If you were to put me in a perfect era, it would be the mid-1990s. I think
me too.
I peaked at Nebworth in 1996, where I think it was I saw Oasis, Cast, Manic Street Preachers, Charlatans. Absolutely brilliant. So if you were to define my music taste, it's kind of probably a bit stuck there. But currently, I think the best band out there is the National, a Manhattan-based band who are just absolutely phenomenal. And I think they've been going for 10 or so years. There's been plenty of albums, but just unbelievable in terms of lyrics, in terms of they're great live, and yeah, massively into the National. What about you?
Brilliant. Well, I'll have to check that out. I'm actually seeing Ash on Sunday. There's a gig at Kentish Town, so yeah, I'd like to get in and see the live music still. And I had Peter Smith on a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, he's been at Reading Festival this year. You've been at Glastonbury this year.
My absolute highlight actually there, and just going back to the 90s theme, was seeing Paul Heaton, Beautiful South. Unbelievable. There was one moment where he did Think for a Minute, which was a House Martin song, and you know, when you're just in the crowd and you just think this is just like something else. So yeah.
So what do you think the future holds for procurement, and what do you think the opportunities are, and what do you think the risks are?
You know, the future is really exciting if we really do move forward and push forward from textbook theory and start looking at changing the way we have our dialogue within the business and within the business world. So I can see a far more diverse future for procurement. So what do I mean by diversity? I think we still have a massive image problem. We're still predominantly white males in the environment. I'm not saying that that's the case in every business, but I think there's a kind of element of it being stuck. So what I would see is in future that it's a far more exciting environment for new starters to come in. There's far less barriers for people to come in. So it will be less about, have you got a degree? Are you SIPS educated? It will be more about actually what impact can you have on the business? And so that's really exciting. I think inevitably there's going to be procurement tech, which is going to make a massive difference. So even the way we go about delivering contracts and how we manage that within a business, as well as the obvious things like P2P systems, will continue to make a huge difference in terms of how we act. And I also think there'll be a different dialogue that procurement has. So we've already referred to the fact that yes, there'll always be that administrative element of how procurement operates, but it'll be more about procurement shaping strategy within businesses. So how we go about making decisions which will impact the future of the business. It will be less about, oh, we now need to run an RFP process. It will be more about, do we need an RFP process? Actually, are we going to be looking at this vendor? What is our vendor strategy? What is our overall strategy? And there's also, what do we want to be important in terms of the future of our cost base, and what therefore do we do to make sure that things like environmental impacts, all of the really important stuff that's going to impact our customers and be more meaningful in the world, will become far more exciting.
Where do you think we could go wrong? Where do you think that will all sort of come tumbling down if we don't, if we go down a particular path?
Do you know, we're facing a challenge at the moment, actually, Rich, because we've got a situation whereby inevitably, as consumer confidence erodes, and we've got the current inflationary impacts and the massive impacts in terms of fuel, electricity costs, we've got a situation whereby I know there's almost been a change over the last few months with businesses looking at, okay, what can we do to cut costs, cut our budget, and typically it's like, oh, we've got a procurement team, let's engage it. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that procurement's role should not have an element of that within it. But I think it's, how do we manage to continue to shape the wider benefits and the wider value that procurement can provide, whilst also delivering on that tactical stuff? And I think there's a danger that we might just default back to being that kind of typical cost-cutting department, damaging supplier relationships, looking at extending payment terms, not doing things in the right way. So I think the biggest risk is actually what's facing us currently, and that's why I'll be determined to be even louder on things like LinkedIn about the right way of working, because I think otherwise we'll just it becomes a cycle, if that makes
Yeah,
sense,
yeah,
and we'll
yeah,
just go
yeah.
back to how we were.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between the way that we've approached it previously, which has been quite incremental in its nature. So, you'll go back year after year and want 5% off or 10% off, and
Yeah,
you look at, well, we would extend out the payment terms, and obviously all these things, they've got a limit. You can't go much further than that. And I think we need to move from being an incremental function to being like more of a transformative function, and
yeah,
yeah, across the business. Really, you look at things. If you don't need something, you can save 100% of its cost. You don't have to
yes.
just negotiate it down 10% year on year. And it's looking at what's the best shape of supply for an organization, and what can you cut out, and what can you make more agile, and all those things. And that's probably where the future is, rather than sort of this incremental approach that we've had previously.
Yeah, interesting you mentioned the point on incremental. There's just a couple of points there. So you aptly described the impact that procurement can truly have. So, and obviously, I also in my current role, I look at properties as well.
Yeah.
Um, there's we've got to renew a lease. Let's negotiate the price. Or there's the wider question in terms of, do we actually need this lease?
Yeah, yeah,
What is our
totally.
future ways of working?
Mm.
How are we going to create a strategy around what our properties and our real estate is? That's the type of thing where procurement has such a bigger impact. And I think that goes back to my point on the difference between purchasing and a
Yeah.
procurement environment. The other thing on incremental is I'm always a little bit skeptical on procurement savings trackers when they become year on year on year, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
yeah, totally. Yeah.
I'd like to think any business that I've worked in, I've had a big and easy to measure impact in year one, because usually I've come into an environment which has been quite immature from a procurement point of view.
Yeah.
So I've been able to have that impact. There's an argument to say if you're still delivering that type of thing year two and year three, well, what did you do year one and what did you miss year one? And I think that that's where we need to quickly transition when we work in businesses from okay, there's been some, I'm going to use the word low hanging fruit. I hate that phrase, but I've used it, that you can deliver on. But actually, the wider value is then on, right, how do we build really good strategic partnerships with our suppliers? How do we develop innovation? How do we drive return on investment for our current supply base?
Yeah, and it's all about the measuring, isn't it? So I think the CFO is very interested in what's
Yeah,
coming out of the budget year on year. But the trouble is, the longer you focus on that, the more procurement's known for just taking cost out, and that doesn't help the procurement brand in itself. And I think looking at metrics that are valuable to the CEO or the COO or whatever, and usually those are more around speed and agility and
yeah,
value rather than cost necessarily. If we're starting to report more of that stuff, and some of it's tricky because it's obviously getting tangible, objective numbers around stuff can be difficult, but yeah, that's how we can sort of change the impact of procurement, if we're actually showing this is what we're delivering and it's not just cost out.
yeah. Is there an element as well on when we're looking to justify our existence through savings, that's more born out of a lack of confidence of procurement in the past?
Yeah,
It
totally.
must have
Yeah.
been like that whole thing of, well, unless we were to have a return on investment of 5 or 7 times our cost, then we might be outsourced.
Yeah, totally.
And
Yeah.
I think that's quite a short term, tired way of thinking. That I think back to the procurement dinosaurs piece. Of course, we're all very pleased to be able to talk about KPIs and where we've delivered savings, but I think unless you underpin that with the bigger picture of what you've been able to do to drive value within your organization, how you've been able to mitigate risk, how you've been able to drive through improvements in the ways of working within the teams, within business functions, and how you've been able to get speed to market, innovation, return on investment. That's a far more positive conversation, and also one which is far more likely to engage stakeholders. And if you think about the golden egg for any procurement team is, how do I make sure that I get good stakeholder engagement? It's not through saying, oh, I'm going to save you X% on your budget, albeit that might be helpful to some. It's how can I make your life better and make sure that you've got the best suppliers that are going to deliver your objectives.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. What important truth about procurement do very few people agree with you on?
One thing I've recognised recently is procurement don't necessarily thrive or enjoy the contracting stage.
Mm.
So there's a element where businesses kind of typically refer to, oh, we've got a contract, procurement, can you have a look at it? Or actually, oh, we need to get this procurement, this contract through to conclusion. Procurement will drive through that review.
Yeah.
From my perspective, and I know from the plenty of people that I work with, that's not where we thrive, or we really add value, or we really enjoy. The bit that I really enjoy is going out to market, looking at sourcing vendors, looking at speaking to them, looking at their innovation, looking at even sitting in workshops, understanding their solution. That's the fun part. But I think there's a misconception within most businesses that, oh, procurement, they really love doing the contract, we'll give it to them. And I think that also is a misconception, which is based on a misunderstanding of the procurement role versus the role of the legal team. And by the way, I'm not saying that contracting isn't an element of what procurement do, but from my point of view, it's probably the least fun, least impactful, and least enjoyable element. And I'm thinking that that's probably the case amongst a lot of procurement individuals too.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where generally the legal team won't have enough resource to cover everything that's going on in procurement. So, and I think because we know a bit about contracts, it's like, and probably a bit more than the business stakeholder, then obviously, it's the job falls to, but it can become a bit more of an admin type approach. And I don't know about you, but as risks have changed over the last sort of 5-10 years, and you've got more things like data protection and GDPR and all that type of stuff, I think it's actually got to that point where some of these things are even a bit more difficult. So you're just managing specialists within certain areas. So it sort of becomes a bit of a herding cats thing rather than actual add value.
Yeah, do you know what? That's a great point, that herding cats thing, is because you become more like a project manager without the project manager experience, if that makes sense. So most of the time, if you've negotiated the commercial framework or are clear on that is, well, what you're doing then really is basically pulling together SMEs to look at all of the different elements. SMEs, subject matter experts. I've got to stop talking in acronyms. And it's quite administrative again. And I think that it's probably something that most procurement people don't necessarily admit, but I would bet if you went and did a poll of what part of the job the procurement enjoy the most, you'd very rarely get contracting at the top of it.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. You should run a poll there, Tom.
I'm never going to put a poll on LinkedIn, Rich. I talked about integrity earlier. Polls killed LinkedIn in 2021. You'll remember it, where literally every element of content was a poll. I even saw polls around what the correct spelling of the name Sinead should be, or something like that. And I just thought, this is now getting silly. So just I refused. I refused to do polls. Actually, there's an interesting point there, though. I think that why do I hate polls so much? Because that was that typical thing of people saw that the algorithm liked polls, so they weren't thinking about what value I can add. They were just thinking, I want to get views and likes. And back to my point on social media. Social media is fine if you genuinely think you can add value and you can build trust with your audience. But if you're just going on social media for the dopamine hit of likes and views, then just find something else to get your dopamine hit. Go for a run.
You
know what I mean? It's then a self-defeating thing. So I'm very conscious, and I mentioned earlier on about not being deliberately controversial. I'm not putting posts on because I want to get impressions or likes or anything like that. I want to spark good debate, but I also want to be forthright with my opinion on things.
Yeah, and I think the debate thing's important. And I see posts that other people are writing, which is based on something, either you or me or some of these other guys put something out there. Did the RFP is dead thing.
Yes.
And I think you posted a bit about your dislike for RFPs, and then someone said it's becoming very fashionable to knock RFPs. What do you think? And it does build out that conversation. Just quickly on RFPs, what's your are they dead or do you think
they're not? They're not dead. They're an overused function of procurement. And I think the problem with RFPs is that you can literally it can become your main touch point with the organization, and then people misunderstand procurement. I think procurement needs to always remember that RFP is just one tool in your toolbox to be able to make sure that you pick the right vendor. The other thing is an RFP run well, and this is where the trick is it allows innovation, it allows discussion, it allows creativity. An RFP which is completely rigid, which has a here's your set of requirements, tick yes, no, whatever, and you're not really getting the best out of the vendors. So I think that RFPs are an art rather than a science. And I know that sounds like a really grandiose statement, and I can probably go into that in more detail, but we need to just be conscious of the fact that, one, they're not a default position in terms of you shouldn't just say, right, we're going to RFP. And two, if you are going to use them, are you making sure that they are constructed in a way that's going to get the best result for the business?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think they're a crutch to some people, aren't they? It's a process that you can run through. You can wheel it out. It's quite easy to do. You're putting a lot of work back on the vendors, really, and sometimes even the requirements. I've seen quite poor requirements lists that go out to the suppliers, and you're sort of expecting them to run some magic in isolation. And I think for me, what I've said is it's all the collaboration and the learning has always been the most important part about the RFP to me, rather than the sort of the selection process. And the trouble is you can put as much science as you want around the criterias and scoring and all this sort of stuff, but ultimately people have an idea in their head and they try and justify it using the science. And actually it is, at the end of the day, it's a gut feel. It's like, is this person going to deliver the value that we think they're going to, or not? And you have to have a bit of governance and process around it, but ultimately, however much scoring, it's a bit of an illusion as to actually the amount of science that sits behind all that.
Yeah, just think about the impact on relationships with suppliers as well. I think procurement needs to stop with the whole, we're going to invite 6 suppliers to do a load of work, which is going to invest loads of their time and resource, but there's only likely going to be 2 outcomes, and we're going to be completely impolite and not even give them a feedback session. And don't ever be that procurement team that sends out an RFP on the 20th of December, expecting a response in 6th of January. You've got 2 weeks to reply. Just be courteous and build decent supplier relationships. This is where sometimes procurement can really let itself down.
Totally.
Just think about the people, and I think that's where we need to move forward. An RFP delivered in a fair way with good dialogue with suppliers, with plenty of time to be able to construct a good kind of creative solution to understand each other businesses is a really good thing. But I just think we need to adapt our style.
Totally. So last question, which book has changed your thinking about procurement the most?
I'm going to say it's not specifically about procurement. It's more about influencing. It's the 48 Laws of Power.
Fantastic.
Remind me the author.
Robert Greene.
That's it, Robert Greene. Thank you. It's having a mental block then. Why did that change my perception? Because I'm obviously mentioned that I'm massively into negotiation, but I think it's the power of influence, which is so much more subtle and so much more kind of has such a historical context with examples. And I think if any procurement individual was to read that book, it just reminds you of the subtleties of influence, and even down to how we speak, how we communicate, how we act with our peers, how we act with people who are maybe on different levels within the organization. I think that's a game changer. So not a specific book about procurement, but a specific book which affects the way that I go about my procurement approach.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're after. There's some good books about procurement, but there's a lot of other books that actually affect your thinking. That's a fantastic book.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, thanks for joining us today. Good to talk to you. And where can people find out more about you if they want?
First and foremost, LinkedIn. I really appreciate the following and people commenting on my posts. And then just to let you know that I've also got a Substack now where I deliver content twice weekly. I do an article. It's the procurement protagonist at substack.com. But I think what I really like doing is writing longer form content, which can help procurement individuals, but also sales teams understand procurement. So it'd be great if people could subscribe to that.
Sure. We'll check you out there. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for having me on. Cheers.
Cheers.